Hi everyone and welcome to the tutorial. Today I'm going to be demonstrating how to pick up and knit stitches in your plush sweater project. We're going to start by taking a look at how to pick up and knit stitches for either your left back piece or your right front piece. In both instances we're going to pick up and knit into the cast on edge of an existing sweater piece. So for our left back, we're going to pick up and knit stitches into the cast on edge of our right back piece, which is completed. And for our right front piece, we're going to pick up and knit stitches into the cast on edge of our completed left front piece. So before we start picking up and knitting stitches, we're going to ensure a couple of things. You should still have a stitch marker placed in whichever existing sweater piece you're picking up and knitting stitches into. And when the stitch marker is facing you, that means that the right side of your fabric is also facing you, as opposed to the wrong side of your fabric. Because I'm just using a little test swatch here to demonstrate, I don't have that stitch marker, but you should. And if you don't, you can also check and make sure that the smooth side of your cable cast on edge is facing you. That means that this is the right side of your fabric as well, because the other side of the cable cast on edge has these little bumps. So in this instance, this would be the wrong side of my fabric and this is the right side. So that tells you as well that the right side of your fabric is facing you. And the other thing we want to make sure of is that our neckline of the existing completed sweater piece is at the right edge of our work. And that also tells us we're picking up and knitting into the correct spot. So if we're picking up and knitting stitches for our left back piece, that would mean that this is our right back piece. And on the right edge of our work, we'd want to see a little dip, which is our right back neckline. If we're picking up and knitting stitches for our right front piece, that would make this our left front piece, and we would see the V of our left front neckline. When we pick up and knit stitches in the existing piece as well, we're going to do so at a 1-to-1 ratio of stitches in the existing piece. So both the back pieces and then both the front pieces start with the same number of stitches, but the backs and fronts together don't start with the same number of stitches. So we're going to make sure we're following the correct stitches for the size we're working. And then if we've cast on the correct number of stitches for the existing piece, we can then go 1 for 1 and we'll end up with that same total number of stitches. And we're going to make sure that we line up our stitches as we pick up and knit to ensure that across the two pieces of our sweater, we have a beautiful and as seamless as possible line of brioche and there's no unsightly jog in our work. Let's get started with the demonstration. Okay, so we're going to grab our working needles and our working yarn, and we're going to start over here and work across from right to left. So the first stitch that we have to pick up and knit into is this slip stitch edge stitch. Now what you can do throughout your pick up and knit is rotate your work slightly so that you can see how the columns of stitches are traveling, and line that up with what the bottom stitch would be, which is the stitch that you're going to pick up and knit into. So if we just rotate this around so we can see the V's in the orientation they would usually be in if we were knitting this piece, we see them like this and we follow that column down to the very bottom, and I've got my tail end of yarn from my cast on, and if I tug on it I can see that it's affecting the size of this stitch here. So that's the first V that I'm going to insert my working needle directly through the center of. So that's the pick up part. And then the knit part is that we're going to wrap our working yarn around the needle and draw the loop through and create a new stitch. So now we come to a brioche knit column. If I rotate this around again, you can see the column of knit stitches here. And we want to go down to the very first V above the cast on edge. And I can see it's just here. So that's what I'm going to insert my working needle into the center of. So that's the pick up. And then the knit is wrap your working yarn around the needle and draw the loop through, and there's our new stitch. The next column is a brioche purl column, but we still have a V. So if we look at the very bottom of that purl column, there's a little V just here. And again, insert your working needle right through that V, and then making sure you're using the end of yarn that's attached to your ball rather than the tail. Wrap it around your working needle and draw a loop through. And you're just going to continue like that across the entire cast on edge. Now the other thing that my pattern says is that I want to make sure that my stitches are stretched out. That's because when you eventually block your project, the brioche stretches out a lot. And you want to make sure that this seam can stretch just as much as the fabric does. Otherwise it's going to pucker in. Now my swatch has been blocked, so it's already been stretched out. That means that I don't really need to worry too much about stretching my fabric out as I work this pick up and knit. But your fabric, if it hasn't been blocked yet, and it shouldn't be if you're in the middle of your project, it's going to be a lot more crumpled up. If you find it challenging to keep your cast on edge stretched out, then an option is that you can block your piece and make sure it's all stretched out, and then it'll make it a bit easier for you as you're doing the pick up and knit. But otherwise, what you want to ensure is that you're keeping the cast on edge and the stitches that you're picking up stretched out with your fingers. So if we come to this next column here, again, knit stitches are just here. Go to the bottom V and pick up a knit, but we're going to make sure that everything is stretched out as we do that. But again, because my swatch has already been blocked, it's already stretched out quite a lot. And if you stuff up, that's okay, just drop the stitch off the needle and then go again. Insert into the V, pick up a knit. So your fingers are just going to make sure that everything's stretched out, and you can constantly do some tugging and just make sure that everything is really evenly spaced and that there is enough stretch in this pick up and knit that you're not going to be disappointed when you block your piece and things stretch out. Okay, so when you get used to it, you may find that you don't need to rotate your work anymore to see where the V's are. You might get used to reading what an upside down V looks like. So just here, and you might get used to just inserting your needle through those spaces. And if you find it easier throughout to keep rotating your work around to be able to spot the V's, there's nothing wrong with that either. So just keep making sure those stitches are spaced really well. Ooh, and I stuffed that one up, so again, just drop off the needle and have another go at picking up and knitting. So it'll be really obvious if you haven't picked up and knit stitches at a 1-to-1 ratio, because when you count your stitches, you'll match that up with what the pattern says you should have, and if you don't have the same number as what the pattern says you should have, then something's gone wrong along the way. But that's easy to fix. You just pull this out and have another go at it. So I'm just coming to my last few stitches. I've got my brioche knit column here. There's my bottom V. Insert my needle into it, draw a loop through, and then we come to the slip stitch, edge stitch again, and there's my bottom V just here. And pick up a knit into there, and if you need to use your fingers or your other needle to pull the loop through, there's nothing wrong with that. So that's how you pick up and knit stitches for either your left back piece or your right front piece. We're now going to take a look at how to pick up and knit stitches for each of our hems. And when we get to the middle of picking up and knitting stitches for our hems, our technique is also going to be very similar to how we pick up and knit stitches at the underarm of each of our sleeves. But I'll talk about that when we get to it. Up until that point, we've got this lovely slip stitch, edge stitch edging, and that's at the bottom of our sweater. And that's what we're going to pick up and knit stitches into for the hems. So again, we're going to take our working needle and our working yarn, And we're going to insert the needle behind both legs of the first slip stitch edge stitch. And then again, take your yarn, wrap it around the needle as if to knit, and then draw a loop through to the right side of your work to create a new stitch. And again, I should have mentioned, you will want to have the right side of your fabric facing up as opposed to the wrong side, which is down here facing down. To pick up and knit into the next edge stitch, we again insert our working needle behind both legs of that stitch, wrap the yarn around the needle as if to knit, and then draw a loop through. Now the pattern says to pick up and knit stitches at an approximate ratio of 6 stitches for every 7 slip stitch edge stitches. That means that we're going to count from 1 to 6 and pick up and knit into every single edge stitch as we come to them. And then when we get to 7, we skip the next edge stitch and then reset our counting and count 1 to 6 again, skip the 7th edge stitch that we come to and reset, and you continue across your entire piece. Just lost my stitches there, I'll just pop them back on, easy done. So if we pretend that here I'm at 5, 6, this would mean that the next edge stitch is the 7th edge stitch, and I skip it. So I don't pick up and knit here, I skip and go to the next edge stitch and insert my needle behind both legs of that stitch, and then continue. You're also given an exact stitch count for picking up and knitting your hem stitches, so you can cross-reference that at the end, and if you've picked up and knit at the ratio given, you should end up with a number incredibly close to what you should have. You might just find your stitch off here or there, and then you can just fix that up really easily by just picking up the extra stitch that you need or dropping the extra stitch or 2 or however many that you have in excess. So I'm just going to continue across, making sure that you don't split your yarn along the way until I get to the center seam. So I'd say I'm about at my center seam there. And why picking up and knitting here is a lot like picking up and knitting for the underarm of our sleeves is that there's no right or wrong way to do it. We just want to make sure that we do the neatest job possible. So we just try our best. So you want to make sure that the stitch that you're picking up and knitting into this spot aligns as closely as possible with this vertical line. And that's going to look nice and neat in our completed sweater. So it's kind of up to you. You can experiment with it and see what looks best. You might sort of insert your needle here, and you can again flip your work around to look at the other side of it and just make sure things are lining up. I'd say that that looks pretty good, so that's where I'm going to pick up and knit my center stitch, and I split the yarn, so I'll just try that again. Here we go. And then we would resume our counting. So it's the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, skip the 7th, 1, 2, 3, up to 6 again, but make sure that you are going for the exact stitch counts given as well. So the nice thing about this entire pick up and knit is that you can fix it up in your next row if you're not entirely happy with where your stitches are exactly. So if I'm now doing my ribbing, and I'm not going to have obviously the exact stitches that I need, but just as an example, when we work across to the center seam, if we're not exactly happy with where that stitch is and how things look, we can drop it off the needle and have another go. So if I have a look at this now, if this is my center seam stitch here and I go, oh, that's actually quite a bit off center, or actually if we say this one here is my center seam stitch, we could say, yeah, I'm not completely happy with how that's lining up. So we can tick back to that stitch again. And you can actually drop it off the needle, and a crochet hook is a great tool to pick up for this, to do your fix. You can also use just your needles if you find it easy as well. And then you can have another go at picking up and knitting that particular stitch. So you can change the position, and maybe I say, actually here is a better spot, and then just place the yarn back on the hook or the needle and draw it through again. Pop it on your needle. And you can do that as many times as you like to get it perfectly aligned, and you can absolutely do that when working the underarm of your sleeves as well, where you've picked up and knit those stitches. If you're not happy with how it looks, just drop those stitches off the needle and try again. Okay, so I hope that you've enjoyed the tutorial and that it's been helpful to learn how to pick up and knit stitches in your plush sweater project. If you enjoyed the video, please feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and I'll see you soon for the next video.